Well, good afternoon. Thank you very much for this great opportunity, for this invitation. And if you want, we can start by introducing ourselves. So, Professor Aronson.
Hi there. I'm Susan Aronson. I'm a professor at the Elliott School of International Affairs, so not a law school professor. And I run something called the Digital Trade and Data Governance Hub, and we look at 68 countries in the EU, how they govern 3 types of data. So specifically public, personal, and proprietary data, and then how that intersects with new technologies such as AI or XR. Nice to see you all.
Hello, my name is Florence Gzel. I'm a professor of private law at the University of Lorraine in France, and I'm also the head of the Sciences Po Digital Governance and Sovereignty Chair in Paris. We mainly work on digital issues, and currently we are working very hard on the very new EU regulations that are being adopted and implemented in Europe. So, of course, we are very much interested in the development of the metaverse and the regulatory challenges of the development of the metaverse.
Oh, great. My name is Daniel Castaño. I'm from Colombia. I'm a law professor at Universidad External de Colombia. I'm also a consultant, and I work on the spectrum of AI, blockchain, and now immersive technologies. So let's kick off this panel. So we are going to be talking under 2 premises. So the first premise is this is not the first time humanity attempts to regulate something complex under uncertainty. We have done it before, and we have done it very well. And then the second premise is immersive technologies are not alien. They don't operate within a vacuum. They're actually subject to current regulations. So I would like to start this debate by asking you, so before trying to regulate something, we need to define the object. So the object is very different from the very definition of AR, VR, XR. So leaving that aside, which is something impossible maybe to define here, there's a recent paper from the IEEE where they make a survey, and there are over 50 different definitions of the metaverse, so we won't be able to reach consent here. But if we are attempting to regulate something, we need to define that object. So I would like to start with Susan.
Well, it seems to me, I don't really want to use the word regulate. I want to use the word govern. And because it seems to me that when we talk about regulation, I don't think anybody knows how to regulate, whether it's data, platforms, companies, et cetera, and that is a problem. Moreover, since these governance questions transcend traditional borders, rules, et cetera, concepts of time and space. Now, I understand, certainly you could say that for other aspects of internet development, but it does seem to me we should be starting now to think about how we govern the technology and the companies using the technology, the role of governments, and ensuring that governance is up to date with the technology. And I think that is a real problem, because traditionally when we talk about governance, governance tries to be technologically neutral. And I think in some respect that makes perfect sense, right? Because you don't want to squash innovation. Stifle, I should have said, innovation. But it seems to me we are going to have to figure out ways to have flexible governance, whether, again, it is of data, it is of platforms, it is of companies, et cetera.
Okay, so first I want, of course, to say that I share Susan's approach, but as I am the French scholar in the room and the European scholar in the room, I have to say that I will speak about regulation, because regulating is something that we are very good at. And I also have to highlight that over the past few months, I have heard there and there that we should probably adopt a Metaverse Act. Since we have so many acts already, it's just one more act. I don't think it's necessary, and I will probably explain why. But my first point here would be that all European regulations are based on a fundamental rights approach. And when asking what do we want to regulate, I think the first answer that we could give is that we need to look at the user experience, and we need to see how fundamental rights are affected. This is what we've been doing in Europe for the past few years regarding AI, regarding blockchains. And so this is what we'll be doing regarding extended reality. We will look at privacy issues. We will look at what we call human dignity, family life, the rights of the child. And we will try to regulate on that basis, since we definitely need to regulate. My second point is that, again, from a European perspective, we are very much concerned about the overwhelming power of big tech. It is now very common in Europe to highlight the fact that those big, often American companies, are super powerful and as powerful as states. And this is something, of course, that we want to deal with. And we don't want to see in those extended reality environments, we don't want to see those big centralized platforms decide everything for us, decide how much avatars we can have, decide how we can authenticate ourselves, decide how our data can be collected. So I think this would be the second point, and my final answer would be, who do we want to regulate? And probably, again, from a European perspective, it would probably be those big actors that we don't want to be too powerful.
Okay, well, that is a very interesting debate, that contrast between, Europe and the United States, and then we'll have to add China to that equation, and then things will be getting very interesting. And then if we talk even about Latin America is trying to follow up, trying to catching up on Europe. So it's not easy. So that will be like the first takeaway. So when we think about regulating the metaverse, it's going to be something local, most likely. Maybe the US and relying on Professors Daniel Soloff's view is going to try to regulate from consumer protection laws, whereas Europe is going to be based on human rights protection.
Well, can we say something? But unfortunately, human rights is an incomplete basis, I think, to make this discussion, because there is no human right to bodily autonomy, right? There's right to life, but there is no human right to your own autonomy. And the impact of, I think, reality, and again, this is not necessarily true. It depends on the business models that are going to be adopted in the metaverses, and perhaps, I was just talking with Virju, perhaps this will evolve in a way that governments have a universal metaverse that is shared. Who knows? But I do very much worry that we're not yet able to make governance an appropriate way to address that problem. We've already seen it with AI, but I worry that it will be much worse. And so that unfortunately, that is an inadequate basis. Let me diss the United States now, if I may, which is, I am very worried about the U.S. perspective on this, because it has become so shaped by, so just yesterday, the State Department announced that they're going to have a director for emerging technologies to look at global issues related to that. Yay, great, good thought, but it's just so inadequate, because the United States, as everybody knows, doesn't have any law governing personal data protection at the national level, and views this through a national security rubric, which is most unfortunate.
That's great. So we might disagree, I would say, in the approach, whether it's consumer protection, whether it's human rights. But I think that we might agree on the consequences taken from a technological perspective. So here we have basically technologies that have a direct impact on the plasticity of the human mind, regardless of the legal tradition where we are, the business model. Like at the end, that's what we're having with these technologies. So with that, we can move to this next question, and it is basically, what are the most pressing ethical and regulatory challenges, in your opinion?
Well, again, this is an issue of governance has not caught up to technology, and I don't have any easy answers here, but I do worry that we do not know how to govern technologies that so threaten democracy and human autonomy. That's the constant theme of what I'm trying to say today, and I, again, have no answers. In the past, what we've tried to do is build principles. So look at the OECD AI principles, and if you think that's the way to move forward, I would argue that that doesn't really get you to where you need to be. Like, there may be certain types of AI that will need to be banned, but there is no consensus on that, right? And so let alone the threats of, or the potential, the positive potential of XR. I don't think we have really, here we are talking about how do we regulate this, right? And so the way I look at this is it's very difficult to regulate things that are so many unknowns and so many different types of regulation, whether it is the relationship between intellectual property regulation, public data, personal data, data that should be in the public domain or once was, but it is now more and more controlled by large companies that happen to be in the United States or China, et cetera. So it's a very tough question. How do you find a consensus on that in these early stages?
What I would say is that we would have to think on the basis of the existing issues that we already face, and this diversity of applicable laws is that has been mentioned this morning is, of course, probably the first question that we need to address, because we already face the issues of raised by the fact that we have transnational platforms operating in multiple jurisdictions, but basically following certain legislations. For example, in France, a colleague of mine has made a research and found that the terms of use of the main platforms that we use on a daily basis, Twitter, Facebook, those terms of use are basically drafted basically similar to the American terms of use. So we have terms of use in French, but they are basically similar to what you can find here in the US. And of course, for French jurists, it is an issue. So my fear or my concern would be to say, well, we are going to face immersive environments. So we will have a very immersive experience. And of course, we will have conflicts, we will have issues, and we will, for obvious reason and pragmatic reason, we will have to solve them online. So we might find new system of solving conflicts, of making people behave properly, that will be totally independent from jurisdictions, from public authorities, and we will, again, ask private companies to rule those environments. And so this is probably the main issue that we face, because, of course, we want those private companies to operate in compliance with our rules and our values. And if I might add something about fundamental rights, there is a very important issue here in extended reality, which is the fact that you can manipulate people, you can detect emotions, you can trace people's emotion, and there is maybe a risk for mental integrity. So this is something that is currently being highlighted in Europe, in France, by people that say, well, we should have a right to respect for mental integrity.
Exactly.
Which already appears in the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. You have a right to physical integrity, but also to mental integrity. So this is, again, a very important issue at the moment.
Great.
Yeah. But how do you translate that into governance? That, to me, is key. And it depends on what those metaverses are going to look like and what business models. And it is not a universal human rights. How do we get people to understand that when they go online and they see, well, someone was talking about it before, the avatar is, Ronald McDonald or whatever, but people may actually think that's the real Ronald McDonald. And, what is truth becomes so hard. People don't know when they are being manipulated. And that's a long-standing, it's since the invention of gossip or advertising, whatever, people have been manipulated. But I think it is so much worse now. And what do you do about it? I would say none of us has any answers, but what I don't see is creative thinking about it. We all sit in our sort of independent boxes as scholars, and we think about intellectual property rights, or we think about platform governance, but we don't really think about how do we put this all together at the national and international levels. And I worry about that.
Great. So from your interventions, I can identify like an underlying concern, and it is actually a general principle of governance and regulation, is that it's basically impossible to anticipate everything and to regulate accordingly. It's just impossible. I mean, lawmakers, they don't have a crystal ball where they can just look and predict the future. But then that has consequences when it comes to the regulatory approach. So from your interventions, I can tell that you proposed, for example, principle-based regulation. It can be also risk-based approach. It can be precautionary approach. It can be even reactionary approach. So actually, it's very hard to tell what is going to be the regulatory approach right now. But then we can probably circle back to what happened with AI. So AI, 5 years ago, we were having this conversation. We don't know, it's too difficult. We don't understand how we're going to regulate AI. And now the EU is like, we know. And we're going to try to regulate it, and then they're in the process of doing so. So with that, let's move to the next question, and that will be, what are the potential unintended consequences of trying to regulate or to provide a governance framework for the metaverse?
Again, at what level? At the national level?
At the national
local
level, yeah.
Until we have a good sense of who is going to be providing those metaverses and what they're going to be used for, I would hesitate to say. But one thing that we've found with our studies of AI governance is that they're really not very democratic, in that there has been very little real attempt to try to educate the public. Finland would be an exception, although I can't say that's very successful model, but I don't know if you've all seen this, but Finland had a free course on AI because they understood that they would be using AI to make decisions that affect people's lives as policymakers, and so they thought, let us try to have an educated citizenry who has some understanding of what AI is. Unfortunately, that course, which is great and very tough, I really struggled with it, to tell you the truth. But in any case, Finland did not consult its public regarding its AI strategies, so who knows? Then that's one level of governance. I worry about this for these technologies. So I think we need to do more to help people understand the technologies that they utilize on a daily basis and understand the implications of that. It's very complicated and it's going to be very boring, but I would start with elementary school. And, I'm looking at the demand side of governance, whereas I think most of us are going to be talking about it on the supply side of governance. What should policymakers do? But I think the public has a responsibility to demand that they understand these things more. And if I were Facebook, I would, be trying to join with educators, not just to bring Facebook products in the classroom, but to have a broader discussion of the implications of these technologies for society. So that was probably a different answer than was intended, but.
I think we have a question from the public. So, Britton, before. Okay.
whenever people ask me about the future of regulation of XR, I always point them to AI-based regulations as a template, because that is a new area of frontier technology. You're getting international consensus around it. There's this element of public education, like you're saying. I was wondering if that's folly, if there are affordances of XR that make pointing people to AI regulation not a good idea.
Well, I mean, certainly XR is built on AI. It's one of many things it's built on, but the level of biometric data is just so great. And what is it, 26 countries and 4 US states have regulations governing the use of biometric data. So that means a lot of countries and states are not there yet. And so that does really worry me. So I'm not sure. I mean, I too, right? We have found in our mapping of data governance, so we map, as example, AI strategies, and that's why I've done so much research on those. So, but I don't know the answer to that, Britton. It's such a good question, but my gut is no. And again, also, I think developing countries, I was just talking about this with somebody, so sorry to be boring and redundant, but developing countries many policymakers in the developing world feel they got screwed on AI, right? They got screwed in that they don't have the capacity. It is going to mean tons of unemployment in those countries because while I'm sure, almost every country has AI researchers and an AI strategy, it's going to change their economy, change the character of their exports, change their employment picture. So they don't want the same thing to happen with XR. So we've been surprised to see, just now countries are starting to develop XR strategies. But again, XR requires not only, lots of personal data mixed with intellectual property, mixed with public data, et cetera, but the character of that data and the effects on human autonomy, I think, are just going to be so much greater. That's just my opinion. I have no evidence to back it up, right? But that's something I hope to work on. Thanks.
So to clarify, do not point people towards AI, or no, the affordances aren't distinctive enough to make AI and XR regulation different?
Okay. I would frame this differently. I would say there is no one model, right? Because AI is not the same as XR. There are things that we can learn from AI regulation, right? And I'm trying my best to do that learning. It's so early in the phase, right? The world has somehow seized on trustworthy AI. As that is going to be the answer. So does that mean that every form of AI before that was untrustworthy? It's just a weird scenario. I wish I had a good answer for you, Britton, that was clever and terse, but I don't. I think there are lots of things that we can learn, but they are not the same. And, are we going to end up in this silly situation where we have trustworthy XR too? I really don't believe, I shouldn't say this because I don't want NSF to hear this because I'm on a team that's a finalist for that big grant, but, AI should be by definition trustworthy, shouldn't it? So we shouldn't make a distinction between untrustworthy and trustworthy AI. It's just bizarre. Sorry.
Okay, so to come back to your previous question, are there any side effects of regulating? Of course, and we know it because we have the experience of the GDPR. You have criticism, so the GDPR is highly protective, but it is also a regulation that increases paperwork, that is very difficult to deal with for small companies. I have a very good example at the moment, which is about the decisions made about Google Analytics, because currently in France, Google Analytics is illegal. It is illegal in Austria as well. I would say it's illegal in Europe, but most of our SMEs are currently using Google Analytics. And this is a real problem of the types of regulations that we are currently adopting. We are trying to address the issue of side effects by, for example, adopting asymmetric regulations, as we are doing with the Digital Services Act, that focuses on very large platforms. Well, you have more obligations for very large platforms. We are also trying to create sandboxes, for example, in the current version of the AI Act that is currently being drafted at the EU level. You have various provisions that create a sandbox regime for small companies. So this is something that we try to do, but of course, as soon as we regulate, as soon as we impose obligations, it can be problematic and in terms of innovation. And my last point here is that in Europe, we already have the GDPR, the DMA, the DSA. We are currently drafting the AI Act, and so the question that we are currently facing is whether we should adapt those regulations to the metaverse, to new environments, or if we should envisage a new type of regulation. I would say that we're good, and we just need to see how those regulations can apply to the current new environments.
Can I add something to that? Because I do want to say something that I think is really important. To me, the future of technological change is not a particular technology, neural brain interface or XR or whatever. The future is how much data sharing can we do in a way that protects human rights, that protects the data, but allows the mixing of that data, and it doesn't accrue to the private sector alone. I phrased that poorly, but I think you get my point. The EU is so way ahead of the United States in that regard. The Data Act, the Digital Markets Act, the EU sees data as potential for innovation, and the idea that you can mix this data as much as possible, and that is going to unleash, that is the future. The problem is that, for XR, it's going to be insane because the amount of data that will be generated, right, is just going to be so huge. And companies don't know how to protect the data that they currently hold. They don't even know where it is, right? There's that famous Facebook quote that was revealed, I think, in November of last year, where they admitted in a court case that they really don't know how much data they hold, let alone. So I would say one form of regulation we didn't talk about is not only related to data sharing, but corporate governance rules. So one thing I've been pushing for forever is to end the opacity of data markets. And how do you do that? You encourage firms, not only, right now, the United States says it is material to report on cyber risks. And of course, firms lie or they don't report on a timely basis when they've been hacked. Happens every week, right? The latest is LastPass, right? The irony of that just shouldn't escape anybody. But if we required firms to at least say to their shareholders, this is the kind of data we collect. These are our plans for using that data. So we're going to group everybody and make predictions about, and we're going to do X, Y, and Z. That might, more transparency might lead to more innovation and also build trust, because all of this is about data markets, right? And this is why I do data governance as opposed to platform governance, if we can move in that direction. I don't know, what do you think?
Well, my first answer is very practical. We will have in those new environments much more data related to emotions, for example. And so the question is, for us at least, should we have a new category of sensitive data that would be protected? Should we have more precisions in our regulation? And I find it difficult. I think it's a very difficult strategy because we have very precise provisions in the GDPR at the moment. It's not easy to comply with them. And do we need to create new legal categories to collect those data, to process those data. So, of course, you want to have transparency. You want to know what these companies are doing. They need to know what they are doing. But I'm not sure that having such a precise regulation is the best strategy. And I frankly don't have the final answer to this question. So today, what is currently being suggested in Europe, and at least in France, is to create, for example, a new category that wouldn't be sensitive data, but sensitive processing. And you would have a specific framework for what would be called sensitive processing. But would this be efficient? Or would this be another rule and another framework and another thing that is difficult to comply with? And I do not, to be honest, I do not have the final solution in this respect.
Yeah, obviously nobody does.
Yeah.
But that's, I do think less opacity, like you were addressing the regulation of personal data itself.
Yeah.
Whereas what I'm saying is that corporations should be more transparent, as well, any private entity should be more transparent about what kind of data it's collecting, when, why, where it's stored, how it's stored, et cetera. We need to know more about that. In the end, that won't protect anybody's human rights, but it will force companies, I think, to perhaps share more of their data, explain why they hoard data, if they do. I mean, no one knows, right? But that's the current assumption. And that could alter data markets. Go ahead.
Well, I'm afraid we're running out of time.
Oh, okay.
Yes, so just to wrap up the conversation, I would say, like, in the face of uncertainty, maybe regulatory sandboxes might be the way. Just to try experimental regulation, try to issue ad hoc regulation that might lead to definite rules. And I think we need to be prepared for what I call the sum of all fears. It is when we have an immersive social media platform running on the Web3, and then it's when things are going to get very interesting. And so just to end up with a futuristic question, is it time to start thinking about the code of metaverse? Just extrapolating Lawrence Lessig's lessons from the 90s. So thank you very much for your time, and thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.